Hey there, my friends. Welcome back to Logistics Life. So here's what we're going to do today. We have a ton happening in the market, right? If you paid attention to any headline, we got port strikes. We got people claiming the freight recession is finally over. We got imports coming in. We got all sorts of stuff to talk about today on the Day on the Logistics Life. Welcome back, my friends. Dean, so good to be back again, my friend. You know, I mean, unbelievable what's happening in the market. I find that these are the times in our market where I get really excited because things are actually happening, right? It's not a repetitive story. And even though some of it is turmoil, I think within every turmoil is opportunity, right? Every dark day has a bright light. I think if we look for it, and it's interesting. We're coming up to today, you know, being Wednesday, the 13th of November. As we're sitting down for this, for the first time in probably 2 weeks, I got on LinkedIn this morning. And I was underimpressed with what's going on. And I, you know, for all of you out there posting, I apologize if it hit you hard. It is what it is. But I was just like, are you kidding me? Like, and I don't know if it's because I've taken a sabbatical from it to try and get another portion of my life systemized and up and running. But my Lord, half the people I'm reading, and I could be wrong, like our good friend Jason Miller, he's on Freight's podcast today. I don't know if you're checking that out. Looking forward to listening to that because that man has his stuff together, as we all know. But I mean, okay, so here's my question to you. Is it too early to call the freight recession over?
Oh, of course.
Okay, I thought so.
Talk about clickbait.
Yes.
You know, like the guy that wrote it always got to be the first. Like, it's ludicrous. Like, we started with Bloodbath 2.0, remember? And I said, there's no way, right? Because he underestimated how much profit carriers had made and how long it's taken carriers to work their way out of the industry. This is by far not over, right? Because we still have excess capacity, Dan. Like, make no mistake, even though we're at the bottom of this trough, if you look at how rates bottom out, we are at the bottom. But as Jason will say this morning on the Freight show and had said on numerous podcasts, we're a ways away from this market turning in an observable way. And he's talking about the second half of this year. So, 2025, right? So, and I think that's spot on. I just don't see the effects of interest rate cuts, changes in, you know, Trump's proposal to change corporate tax rates. You know, we've got the fallout from a trade war that could happen. You know, if we raise 60% tariff, if we go to 60% tariff on China, does that hit our exports in a retaliatory way from countries like China? Like, we still don't know what the net effect is. But we've seen Trump 1.0 effect on tariffs way back in 2018. So we know what that is. So we can expect much of the same. So, Dan, there's still too much to go on to say the freight recession's completely over, because we've got the first half of next year to get through, because there still is plenty of capacity in the market to meet whatever demand there is that's sort of bubbling along. You still see it in rates. And I'll give you a data point. On last week's show, if you remember, we said that new rates coming into routing guides in the dry van space were positive for the first time this year. Right, so that means that they're up 1.2%. So that was the first time in 46 weeks new rates negotiated by carriers with their shippers were positive compared to the rates they were replacing from the prior year's RFP. Well, then they drop right back down negative the week after, right? So for 46 of 47 weeks, carrier rates that are brand new coming into routing guides for the first load have been negative. So it depends how you design how you define a freight recession, right? So there's lots of ways to do it. I look at it, or we look at it, in terms of when rates change year over year from negative to positive. We said 3 months ago the freight recession had already ended because rates had gone positive year over year. And if you remember that discussion.
Yep.
So
100%.
as to the headlines, we were the first. Like, that's just childish. it depends on who you read and who's got the biggest, bullhorn, I believe. So
there's also something, Dean, that I've seen it probably over the last 2 weeks. And I guess the biggest example of this is the article I shared with you yesterday or the day before, I believe.
Yeah.
So McKevitt came out and decided to cease operations. Now, this is an interesting one. And this is one where I've got no proof to this, everyone. So this is pure speculation at this point. But I've asked a few really knowledgeable people in the market. And the consensus is, like I texted you this morning, is McKevitt been around 76 years. They are what we call a staple, a cornerstone Canadian carrier, right? They're one of the oldest Canadian carriers. They handled a lot of Northern Ontario. I've dealt with them for years. Great carrier. The suspect is, and I'm sure this information will come out over time, is they've ceased operations. However, all the reports saying, but they haven't filed for Chapter 11.
Right.
I think we're at a point with especially generational carriers where maybe it's been like the McKevitts, it's been a family company for years. And they're just at a point where, like, we've made all our money. We're not interested in this up and down and this like losing your shirt 1 year game. Like, people in business want to make money. And I think on the carrier side, maybe it's so up and down over the last little while. It's like, listen, we had our runway. We're going to gracefully bow out before we have to file and destroy that name.
Dan, it's been going on globally. Like, so it's a generational thing. Right, so you've got multi-generational people coming through the business. If McKevitt was founded by Mr. McKevitt, right, let's say, and then the next generation comes in and takes over, it's very different. There's always friction between how the company should be run between generations, right? And then you're overlaying that, you've got all the technology changes, the speed of technological adoption, the volatility in the freight market, all the geopolitical risk, all the change in administrations, all this. We've got a lot more things going on these days than we did, say, before the turn of the century. And when a lot of these companies were built, there was a lot more predictability, going from the 70s through the 2000s in the freight market, I think. Yeah. Because I've seen in my home country, Australia, dozens of companies like McKevitt go out of business. They just literally say, you know what, we've had enough. And they just park the trucks, put them up for auction, and sell their business. And I think for some of those folks, it just got too hard. It's hard to find drivers. The industry's over-regulated. EPA regulations become very burdensome. I think the biggest problem, I talk to carriers in Australia, and I'd love to get the McKevitt's take on this, and I think it's the same the world over. It's really hard to find good drivers that want to make this a career and look after your equipment and your customers. There's a very transient driver population now that are driving trucks in between other jobs. And then they are just not, in the main, not serious about this as a profession. And I give you an example, like if you haven't got a CB radio in your truck, you are not serious about trucking. I don't care what you say, right? Especially in winter. If you don't have a life-preserving device like a CB radio to communicate with other professional drivers, you are running headlong into a wreck. It happens every single week. I'm not apologetic about that in the slightest. Like, if you're going to be, I don't think a lot of folks realize how serious you have to be to drive a truck. Now, where they skate by is with all the technology in these trucks, it provides a safety net around them where the drivers actually don't have to step up like we used to, right? So there's a whole, so when it comes to like the McKevitt family, it's a very different business. The trucks are different. They have more technology. They cost more. They break down more. The engines don't last as long. Customers are more demanding. Customers have got more transparency. They've got more rate negotiation tools. The margins are harder to come by. And you've probably got a lot more competition out there now, especially in Canada. So you've got a lot more rate cutting going on. So if you think of all of that stuff that I've just sort of waffled on about for 10 minutes, like, it's a very different business these days. And I could see someone that started a company 76 years ago saying, yeah, this is just not worth it anymore, because you have to assume an enormous amount of risk these days. Don't forget, you've got plaintiff attorneys wanting to take you to the cleaners if your vehicle has an accident, right or wrong, whether you're in the fault or not. So you could see a family saying, you know what, we've got too much exposure here for our family business. It's time to go do something else. And I know that's the case in Australia with some companies that have been around for a lot longer than the McKevitt company has. But it's the same. It's not different because it's the other side of the world. The dynamics are very much the same in Western cultures with the same issue going on. So I think 100%. That's part of it. I had a customer yesterday say to me, there's a lot of small fleets, and he used the word on the ropes. And I thought that is a really good way to describe where companies are right now. I think, Dan, there's the mid-tier carrier that's probably in that, maybe 50 to 500 range. I think that tier is really on the ropes right now. And if you've been reading in Freight Waves, we've seen several of them go out of business, Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the last month. So I think there's more to come in that space, because peak season will give us a bit of tailwind to the end of December. And then I think that's when we start to see a big clean out, and people just say, this is too hard. Because of where you started the show, if you have port strikes, January 15, port strike imminent on the eastern Gulf Coast, Canadian port strikes about to end, and then you've got on top of that
possibly end. And possibly.
And then
there's still nothing concrete. Like the government still hasn't. But go on.
And then you've got January 20 inauguration day and a 60% tariff on China, possibly 10% elsewhere. What you're going to see is people scrambling right now to get Q1 inventory in before January 20. Yep. So what that means is absent demand for more stuff, right? You're just bringing forward next year's freight volume for all those people in drayage, intermodal, truckload that do long distance truckload, or, draying containers off Savannah, or so that's where, if you think about Q1 next year and all the volatility that could go along with it, enthusiasm and all of the euphoria around a Trump administration, coming in next year will evaporate quickly, because freight demand, I think, is still not solid enough to say this freight recession's over. It's just too much volatility in the market. So, Jason Miller's going to say here in an hour or so that freight demand is still flat. We're still sort of wallowing along the bottom of this trough, with freight tonnage or ton miles about where they were in 2018, maybe 2019. They're a long way off where he's seeing US manufacturing picking up at a rate that would say, we can predict this freight recession is over and we're on the glide path sort of upwards. We're not there yet. Even though capacity is exiting, ing, it hasn't exited. As in, we're still seeing a rate of carriers decreasing their truck counts, and rates are still, flat, bottoming out, up and down a little bit. So we're still at the bottom of this freight market, Dan. But if you said, what's your synopsis for next year? It's up, right? So things are going to improve next year. I think simply because we're going to have the capacity is going to realign itself. We're going to see enough trucks exit between now and the end of first quarter, where you're just going to see seasonality come in the spring, and rates is going to start to gradually go up from there.
So I agree with all of that. I think there's going to be, and for lack of a better word, the only way I could phrase it is a new breed of trucking companies.
Right.
I look at what's happening in the freight market, like a conversation I was having with a buddy of mine, where he asked me on the weekend, he's like, where are all the farms going?
Right.
Like in Ontario, we're big agriculture, and you're watching second and third generation farmers sell their land for tens of millions of dollars to developers.
Yep.
And I said to him, and I know I've said this on the show before, but I said to him, I said, Marty, here's the thing, right? Think about this for a second. So your grandfather was a farmer, and your father was a farmer, and you have 500 acres. And you can get 300,000 an acre. You have 500 acres, and you're maxed out. You're buying multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. The winters don't have enough snow. The summers aren't wet enough. You're yielding a third or 2/3 or even 3/4 of the crop. You're working 9 days a week, call it, with the hours you put in, sun up till sundown, all summer long. you're worrying about your harvest in the winter because you've got winter wheat or whatever in.
Right.
I said, all to make 20, 30% less money, like exports. And I go, and somebody comes to you and offers you this massive bag of money that will take care of you, your children, and your grandchildren.
You're a buyer. Absolutely.
You're gone. You're like, okay, good. But here's the thing, Dean. This is what I see in our market. Is I think it's going to be a new breed of trucking companies that emerge in 2025. Now, whether that be some of the companies that are already in the business or whether it be up and comers. So you look at farming, right? Remember we talked about vertical farming and how, right? So that's the new generation of farming is vertical farming. They're going to control their ecosystem. They're going to control their environment. And I think this is what we're leaning into. I think this is a big reason. And I'm going to try and get a hold of a McKevitt to see, but I think this is a big reason these companies are saying, all right, I'm done with this, because you hit the nail on the head. You know, the driver pool is, I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and say maybe 40% of what it was from a quality perspective. Don't get me wrong. I know there's companies out there that still have great drivers. I see them every day. But I still have drivers that are not so great. And I speak to my buddy who drives the West Coast up and down through the mountains. And he says, Dan, the storm 2 weeks ago, he called me and he goes, you'll never believe it again. I go, people are on the side of the road, don't know how to chain. He goes, Dan, there's so many trucks in the ditch right now. He goes, why do companies put human lives at risk like this? Not only the driver, but everybody else around them. And it's asinine to think.
Well, Dan, I put a lot of this down to training. I don't begrudge the drivers who, you know, maybe immigrants to this country come in to fill a void or come out of school and start driving trucks or switch careers. Absent experience, right? This is a really risky job. Where we started the show, this can kill you. Like, and if it doesn't kill you, you have an accident, it could put you in jail for life. There's plenty of precedent here. Because everybody's got cameras, everybody's got phones, there's evidence everywhere now, and plaintiff attorneys are itching for nuclear verdicts to prove that you were negligent. So,
and there's four-wheelers out on the road that are just brain dead as well. Let's call it a spade, right?
Yeah, they cause a lot of the problems. But here's the problem. If you don't train your drivers and take the time to teach them about how to do this job properly, you're inviting the sort of trouble and liability. And that gets to the exposure that families are just saying, we can't put up with this level of exposure anymore, because, you know, you take a chance. Like, you've got to move the freight, you've got it the loads, you've got a commitment to the contract, you've agreed on a rate, you've got a service level commitment. You have to run the truck. And a lot of times I think they just hope nothing bad happens. And I've been in a situation where I run a truck company like that. I used to say, if I didn't get a phone call overnight, it was a good night. Like, if somebody wasn't in the ditch, didn't wreck something, didn't do something stupid, it was a good night, because at nighttime, crazy stuff happens because we all get tired. And that's not a reflection on experience. You can get tired even if you're really experienced, but at night, a lot of crazy stuff happens. So I think this is just a very different industry. And my experience spans 50 years of, you know, knowing how trucks work in three continents, right? So and it's the same sort of pattern you see across the world. This is a very different industry, Dan. And I think the point that I think I'll sort of end this thought on, the companies that are going to survive are the ones that have to invest in technology, right? So you think about EVs, autonomous trucks, think about Schneider, right? So we've got AB5 has essentially classified a lot of independent contractors as employees in California. So then and then they've got their zero EV policy, where they want, you know, a large percentage of port trucks in electric. So who can afford that? I mean, they do have a voucher system where small carriers can avail themselves, but these trucks are really expensive. In comes Schneider, and they've got 300 trucks out there that are battery powered, doing dray work. So you can see what's happening. The only companies that will be sort of in those spaces are the ones that are well capitalized, that can invest in future technology to make it work. So there is a change underway, and that's who's going to be left standing, are the companies that can adapt to technology, but can also afford to adapt to technology, because we're about to head into an era. And again, this sort of overlays now the Trump administration, which is very I won't say anti-regulation, but there's a deregulatory phase about to happen here that could be a tailwind for trucking industry in terms of the adoption of zero electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles, sorry, to be clear. So a lot of good things could happen to the trucking industry this year. Changes in the tax code, like if we see a change in the corporate tax rate, that could be a stimulus for more freight.
Yep.
Lots to unpack next year, because we've got to move from campaign rhetoric to, tweets or whatever, to actual policy being developed next year. And that's why I think it's too early to say that this market has turned around. The indicators look good, but we're still not there yet. Like we're still got a long way to go.
It's not quote unquote officially over. We've got quite a bit of hiking up the mountain to do. I think I agree with you. I think a lot of companies are, come January, probably more towards the end of January, where companies realize, oh my gosh, all my customers pull forward freight. New tariffs are being implemented, Chinese New Year, like all of these things are going to add up to more companies going out. I agree.
Don't forget, 12/31 is your annual insurance policy renewal date for a lot of truck carriers, small carriers in particular. So you're going to see a lot of carriers take advantage of the peak shipping season, make as much money as they can in this quarter, and then say, you know what, time to go. We're out. They'll go from independent contractor back to leased on, or they'll just sell their trucks. And we typically see an exodus of small carriers in January every year. So it won't be surprising to see some hang in there. Diesel prices are dropping, so there's another tailwind there. Rates going up, you could see some margin expansion. But then carriers are acutely aware that Q1 is going to be pretty volatile. And I think some of them will say, enough's enough. So I'm sort of expecting that to happen in January. And then we get into the phase of the market starting to tighten every time there's a, major event, like a polar vortex type event like we had in January this year.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be an interesting road over the next, couple of months. I'm actually looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing how this is eventually going to play out. So let's talk about the volumes, and some numbers are in. On a very positive side as well, import numbers are in. Let's talk about that.
Imports, remember, are about 10 to 12% of truckload demand. But of course, a lot of our imports end up as inputs into other manufacturing processes down the road. So they do they are part of the truckload demand story. Imports came in, containerized volumes. So when we talk about TEU, 20-foot equivalent units, they were down 5% in October, but 8% higher than last October. October's total was 6.25 million. And down only about 5,000 containers less. So this October, just gone, was only 5,000 less than the record set for the month of October in 2020 at the peak of the e-commerce import retailing boom. So if you want to talk about, how much, even though volumes were down, right, we're still bringing in, it was almost the highest volume of containers in the month of October going back to 2018. Now, last month was the highest number of containers brought in for the month of September. So we're still bringing in a fair bit of volume because shippers have been aware that this strike action could happen, that we've got tariffs coming in, Red Sea crisis bubbling along, a lot of diversion. So I think a lot of shippers were way ahead of this. What was different this time around was that, and this is really unusual, Dan, the Port of Long Beach beat out New York for second place in terms of the most number of containers delivered. And so it normally goes Los Angeles, New York, Long Beach. Right now, Long Beach and Los Angeles are right next to each other. But this year it went Los Angeles, or this month, Los Angeles, Long Beach, New York, Savannah, Houston. So New York for the first time was number 3. I haven't seen it like that in years. So it sort of speaks to the surge in imports that have been coming into the West Coast. If you sort of
think that has anything to do with the ILA strike based on the timeline?
Yeah.
Right. I think people would then revert to or start shipping to the West Coast because they didn't know how long the ILA strike on the East East Coast would be, right? So
I think this is the tail end of that, Dan.
Yeah. So would you expect that to turn around in the next 2 months and New York become number two again?
Well, for this year's retail season inventory, yep. Right. So I think a lot of people would have been thinking, so the imports that are in here now, kind of, if you're ordering stuff now and you've got a 3-week transit, you're into December and you're probably not bringing in imports that are going to be for this retail season, right? This shipping season. What you may see pull forward is the pre-Chinese New Year, spring inventory build stock. You might see that start to come forward a little bit earlier. So a lot of that volume's already in. So that's why volumes are kind of tailing off, I think, in my opinion. That's why you're seeing volumes lower month over month, but still at very high levels, because I think we've pulled forward a bit of Q1 volume already. So so definitely a big surge on the West Coast. Gulf Coast volumes down substantially, because I think we've just seen a big diversion of freight to the West Coast. West Coast volumes were up 21%. East Coast volume year over year, East Coast volumes were only up 9% year over year. So whichever way you slice it, you can see there's been a shift in some tonnage to the West Coast, and that has brought more freight into that market. And of course, what we typically see whenever that happens is much stronger freight rates and demand on the West Coast. California's been a really strong market for truckload carriers for probably 6 months now. It wasn't all that way. I mean, a year ago, Dan, we were reporting about a very weak West Coast market. I'm just pulling up some dry van data now, but volumes off the West Coast. So nationally, truckload volumes dry van truckload volumes, these are loads moved, are up. Hang on, let me quickly refresh this. So they're up 7% year over year. They're up about the same amount out of California. Rates out of California, Dan, to give you a sense of how much capacity has tightened out of Los Angeles, which is the biggest, port market, rates are up 21 cents a mile or 11% year over year off the West Coast, out of those big markets over there. One of the big lanes I watch is out to Phoenix, Los Angeles, Phoenix, where a lot of imports go to, that big warehouse distribution market. Yep. Rates are up 19 cents a mile to $3. Right, so the national average dry van rate's $1.65, but if you're hauling freight off Los Angeles out to Phoenix, it's $3 a mile. The volume of loads moved are up 12% year over year. Rates are up 7%. So you can just see the health of the freight market on the West Coast has been buoyed by a lot more imports that have been coming into that freight market in especially the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, which are sort of in that 5-mile port of the San Pedro Bay port complex area. I think it's a 5-mile radius around them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know a lot of companies are moving to Phoenix, and I see that as being like, well, Phoenix is the next hotbed in our market these days, right? Yeah. Okay, so I'll be curious to see how the strike in Canada, or the lockout, we can call it right now in Canada, is actually going to increase the volume for both East Coast and West Coast northern ports. Yeah. Because I hear a lot of people now already saying, okay, no, we're diverting from, call it BC, whichever one they're going to in BC, Surrey, or whatever. And now they're trying to divert to Seattle and just truck it up, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I'd read that some people were waiting it out because they were sure and I'm just going to pull up the number of vessels that are at anchor. So if you give me a second here, I can tell you pretty quickly what that looks like.
Because I'd like to end the show on that note, because I mean, we're hearing reports of between, call it 4 and 5 business day delays for every day that the lockout continues. Right. Yep. So at this point, based on how long we're talking, probably pretty close to the last week of December. Yeah. To clear up. However, we have Christmas in there. We have New Year's in there. So that's a couple of days delay as well. Yep. We're almost heading into January by this point. Yeah. Now, of course, all of this is going to be, like you said, it's going to be, well, I'm sure there's some containers on the water that are supposed to be in for this holiday season that are just kind of stuck in this position. Right. But I think for the majority of it kind of coming in after, call it this week, we knew it wouldn't be for this holiday season or this retail season, I guess. Yeah.
So I think, Dan, you've got there's a dozen vessels in Vancouver right now, but that's probably half bulkers versus containers, because you have a lot of grain exports going out of there. Prince Rupert's probably the more interesting one, Dan. You've got two big container ships sitting out in Chatham Sound, and then you've got a couple sitting right in the port of Prince Rupert. That's one that I watch more often, because they run on dock rail 4 trains daily to Chicago. So that's more of an interesting port hub. They're not big in terms of volume. You're talking about 5% of total TEU volume in North America at Prince Rupert, Vancouver, and then that compared to SeaTac, they're both about 5% each. So I don't know that people have moved enough to say we're going to see an increase in truckload volume in that market just yet. I'm just pulling up that market here. So truck capacity was tight last week. It's eased this week. Right, so I suspect we didn't see a big diversion of freight because truckload volumes actually out of Seattle went down 4% last week. Well, capacity was tighter, Dan. So this is kind of interesting. The volume of loads went down, but rates went up 10 cents a mile for outbound loads out of Seattle. So there was some capacity tightness. Hard to say whether that was already because of market tightness and somehow some of those imports had already diverted to the Seattle market, but I think you're going to see that market settle right down pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think it'll, this week will be very very telling as to what will happen with future orders, right?
Yeah.
I know a lot of customers that are at 130% capacity in their warehouses just from pulling so much stock forward, and to the point where a lot of them, I said this last week, but it begs to reiterate again. A lot of them are saying, like, if you don't get your truck in here, every other truck is delayed.
Yeah.
And that just causes way more issues than we need. Okay, awesome. So I guess the interesting point will be is in the next coming weeks is how companies respond/react to the new, I guess, what would you call it, for the new administration coming in?
Yeah.
What would happen with both imports and exports? And speaking with a couple of clients that we have, they're all of a sudden like bombarded with orders going out to Asia.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I'm having a conversation with one of them and they're like, oh my gosh, that's probably what it is. Like, it's just this huge bombardment.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see what comes in the next little while. For all of you watching and listening, just do yourself a favor before you go and start reaching from the rooftops and screaming that the freight recession is over. Listen to my man Dean and go to Freightos and actually if you're around today, I think it's from 9
Eastern,
9 Eastern to 10 Eastern.
Yeah.
Go listen to that report with Jason Miller, because I think it'll be very good for you. I mean, I registered. I've got a meeting then, but I'm hoping to catch the replay on it.
Yeah.
Because I think these pieces of the puzzle, Dean, are so important, right?
Yeah.
People see a post and they take it as gold, and they, it's crazy how much information is not necessarily, well, so I guess like you said at the beginning, clickbait would probably be the best way to put it, right? Like who gets to market first? And if we get to market first, is it going to be something? So anyways, we won't even get into that because that's a whole other hour conversation.
Yeah. But I think, Dan, change, the one thing that's very different about this market is that change is now a constant, and you have to be right on top of every single data point, be working with your customers every single day, because change is one of the things that we all would like it just to stay the same as it was. But there's one thing that's inevitable about this freight market and that's change is constant, and that'll be the roller coaster ride we're on next year for sure.